people are saying, I want a partnership at work. I don't want a dictatorship. I don't want an authoritative type of relationship or a power struggle. Like, I know I add value. You want value. Let's come together and make something great happen. And let's align that to things like values, which, we know from especially millennials and Gen Z is really, really important. Like, the work that I do must fulfill some deeper part of my purpose.
What if the key to transformation lies in shifting your perspective? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Every conversation here is about one thing: how empathy changes the way we lead, connect, and create impact. Each episode, we get to explore deep, authentic conversations designed to expand your mindset. Whether you're looking to transform your leadership, deepen your relationships within your circle, your community, and friends, or gain clarity in your own personal growth, each episode will inspire you to see things differently and take action. If you're ready to challenge your thinking and embrace transformation, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. This episode with Angela is so beautiful. Angela is an organizational psychologist, and she's really passionate about conscious culture and community building. And I would say that her work is really in the intersection of social responsibility and corporate workplace. She feels so committed to this, and you hear it in everything that she talks about. It's like woven into her DNA. She is a true thought leader. And today's conversation, we really get to dive in deeply about what it means to work in a place where it really reflects the world that we live in today. Our lives, our world, so much is intertwined. We don't live in a world anymore where everything is separated. So for those of you who are struggling to figure out, like, how do we really reimagine the role of work in our society, and how do we advance like collective liberation? How do we think about our shared humanity and progressing towards like a more equitable future? This is really an incredible episode for you to listen to. Hi, Angela.
Hi, Pyle. How are you? Good to see you.
Good. Good to see you too. I'm so excited to talk to you today because you're the one person that I know, like actually know, who is like so passionate about the workplace while everybody else is trying to quiet quit, quiet luxurification, you know,
Mm.
find a gig thing, whatever it is. But you are really determined to helping workplaces become a place where people actually would want to be. So I feel
Mm.
like every corporation should be looking at you and being like, okay, if she's like the one millennial that wants to be here, like, and wants other people to come back, then we need to talk to Angela.
Mm. I will take that role in in this work. Yeah, it's not that I love the workplace as it is. It's just that I see the responsibility and the impact of what it can be. And I think that's like the North Star for me, and seeing like this is a whole system that impacts a big portion of people's lives. And it's kind of shitty. So what can we do to
Kind
change
of.
it? It's a little shitty. It's a lot of shitty. So and I know it. I know the paradigms and the norms around workplace, and I'm a millennial, so I'm like this bridge between the old and the new, I feel like. So I think
Yeah.
that's why I do it.
No, I love it. I mean, I think people forget that corporate was not born that long ago. But the thing is that it just adopted all of the normalcies that were existing in the factory type of work environments, like when,
Mhm.
literally from the Industrial Revolution and everything. And what was it? It was actually just like 100 years ago, which is crazy to hear this, but it was 100 years ago when they normalized 5 day work
Mhm.
days. It
Mhm.
was before that, it was like 6 or 7 days, and it was like 12-hour shifts. Like they normalized it like 100 years ago for it to be like a 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And the
Mhm.
fact that we haven't moved at all in 100 years, and we've just accepted that, right? And there's always this idea of like, well, why? Why do we need to change? Like, what does it mean? But it's like
Mm.
the world is changing so fast. And, there's so much happening, like the globalization, technology, like, the integration of like just different work styles, like all these things. So like,
Yes.
what is it
Mhm.
that, you feel the most passionate about and committed to specifically when you're talking to, leaders actually in the work in corporate who are trying to
Mhm.
understand why they need to even make a shift. Like why, and the complaint is always that like, oh, Gen Z, millennials, like they're asking for like we in our day, we put up with this stuff, right? So why is it that they need to shift?
Yeah, well, so going back to your point around the industrial era and the industrial revolution, we are at a point in history right now that we haven't seen since that time of massive change in the, I would say, the social contract between employers and employees. There is a huge shift happening underneath our feet, like tectonically. And what I'm most passionate about is talking about the fact that this is actually not anything new. This happens in history every so often. We look at the next generation and say the kids don't want to work anymore. They're entitled, they're lazy. Like, this is nothing new. This is
Yeah.
a cycle that happens every so often. And then it kind of seeps into pop culture, and you hear about the great resignation and quiet quitting and all the buzzwords. But really, what we're talking about is at this moment, my thesis around this is we have a collection of generations that are purpose driven, values driven, and I call them Gen Y, not to be confused with Y, but Gen like WHY question mark.
I love
So
it.
I'm starting to think about this movement of people, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and the difference of their perception of workplace compared to their predecessors. And the fact that they're saying, you know what, it's no longer acceptable to not talk about social issues at work. It's no longer acceptable for me to impact my mental health at my workplace or work in a toxic environment or deal with a toxic leader. So that's what I'm passionate about, is helping organizations understand that they can no longer live on an island. If anyone's watched Severance before, the show, where there's this complete separation of work and home and never the two shall cross, isn't a reality anymore. That's a really
Yeah.
old paradigm that we have to kind of get over and realize like the whole human comes to work.
Yeah. I love that you call it Generation Y, like WHY, because it really is that we in corporate or like in any workplaces, we ask people to be curious. We ask people to be like curious when it comes to solving a problem for them, right? But
Yes.
if you're a naturally curious person, you're also going to be naturally curious too. Well, why are we functioning the way we are? If you want change management, you want systems improvements, we want processes improvements, all of that requires us to look at like the fact that you're not robots working, in the
Mhm.
system, you're humans, right? And I know for me, which is so interesting is that, when I had kind of moved into corporate space and stuff and working
Mhm.
there, it was really hard. It was definitely really hard. And part of it was because I have a chronic illness and I had like multiple
Mhm.
autoimmune stuff, right? And I literally had a manager, like my direct manager, tell me when I mentioned to her that, hey, listen, that, there may be days where I have a little bit of brain fog. There may be days where I'm a little
Mhm.
inflamed, so I'm moving a little slowly.
Mhm.
So I just want you to be aware of it that I'm not like, not that I'm not on my game, like I'm being productive, I'm doing everything I'm doing. It's just that I may be a little bit more fatigued on certain days. Um, and her response was, "Oh no, you're just a girl in your mid 30s. Like, it's just your hormone. Like
Uh,
that's not a big deal. Like, I don't
wow.
completely dismissed, right?" And then there was this constant fear of like, am I doing enough and whatever? And that level of like stress and
Mm.
inability to understand that, like, I'm still meeting my deadlines. I'm still doing everything that you're asking me to do. I'm going above and beyond. I'm building relationships, all the things. But there was literally no, um, there was no acceptance, right? And ultimately ended up leaving corporate because it brought up so much. It brought up not just about that, but it also brought up about like, being the only brown person in
Mhm.
an entirely white team. Like I literally thought I was just like a check mark for them. So many things where I'm just like, you know what, F it. I'm just gonna go and be my own entrepreneur. Not that being an entrepreneur is supposed to be like, oh, an easy task for someone with chronic illnesses, but it literally feels like it's the only choice.
Mm. Yeah, and I think a lot of I would say marginalized entities, identities, whether it is, black and brown women or people with disabilities, or there's something that is causing you to be on the margins of corporate America because of the way it was built, because it wasn't built for us, right? It
Right.
wasn't built with these differences in mind around breaking down some of our biases about what is productivity and what does that mean. And there are some, and that's why I say Gen Y, because this generation is like, well, help me understand how that makes sense. Or if
Yeah.
I'm able to get something done that it takes you 30 hours, but it takes me 2 hours, why can't I go do a load of laundry during my
Right.
workday? Right.
Yeah.
Or if I'm meeting outcomes, so really there's this breaking down of old biases and paradigms that is freaking the predecessor generations out because it's all they know. I do think, and I don't want to stereotype because we tend to stereotype with generations, but
Yeah.
Gen Y is also, I think, the people who are coming from other generations and are maybe experiencing a little FOMO, like,
Yeah.
wow, like this next generation is really like questioning some of the things that I perpetuated, as a leader or as a worker in my 30s. And actually, like that makes a lot of sense. And I have FOMO, but I also want to be a part of the movement now and
Yeah.
contribute to that. So I do think it is all generations who can be Gen Y, but I do think we're seeing this concentrated emerging group of leaders and workers who are just changing the game around what it means to work somewhere and what that means in the context of broader society and life.
Yeah, that's why I think I really love Generation Y because it's really focusing more on the psychographic of the individual versus like, stereotyping them from the demographic. Like I think that, if you think about it, right? Even if we take it back, Richard Branson, right? Richard Branson
Mm.
is what? Is he a baby boomer?
I think he might be a boomer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think he's a
Or
baby
Gen X.
boomer.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe on the cusp or something.
Mhm.
But I mean, he was one of the pioneering leaders of, understanding why it's important to invest in your people. And he started doing that in the 80s as
Mhm.
a transformational leadership, right? So like I agree with you that it isn't necessarily, and I think this is what creates the division in where people start to take sides or feel offended that like, oh, what do you mean that, we didn't have our own trials and
Yeah.
tribulations, that we didn't have these things. So that's where I think that what you're actually talking about, and you probably realize it, but it's just that when you talk about generation WHY,
Mhm.
when you're saying that, you're actually bridging gaps together because
Mm.
you're not now, labeling people. You're not labeling them based off of like what group they belong to, what industry they're in, or anything. You're just saying to them, like, are you curious? If you're curious, you're
Mhm.
part of this group. Like, you
Yeah.
want this, right? Like, and it's actually bridging the gap. And I'm curious that like in your work, have you seen
Mm.
that? Have you seen the bridging of people coming from like all different sides and starting to like understand each other? Like, how do you get people to truly not just because change is so hard for people?
Mm.
So, how do you get people from all different sides of it to start to see like, okay, maybe it's okay that Gen Z cares about their mental health?
Yeah, I definitely think there's kind of two general themes. One is, again, kind of the perpetual, like the kids don't want to work, they're entitled. Uh, I didn't get that when I was growing up, like we had to power through and what's wrong with these kids? There's that mentality, I'd say. And then there is the mentality of, maybe I am missing something. Maybe I do need to check my bias. I just delivered a keynote yesterday at a conference, and one of the women who came up to me afterwards, she's like, Angela, you pushed my buttons. Like, because she was a part of this, I would say probably Gen X, population. And she's like, you really, really pushed my buttons. And we had a conversation about it. It was great. I'm like, tell me more. What does that mean? She's like, there's people coming in my office constantly telling me about their personal lives, and like it's 80% of my time. And so we talked about, what does it look like to have open, psychologically safe teams, but also set boundaries and ensure like the gossip and the drama isn't a part of, the workplace. And so I think there's a middle ground of people who are like, this really pushes my buttons, but I realize something is changing. I can sense the shift. And I can remember back when I was in my 20s and 30s how I was searching for something new and different and change. And so I do think there's a lot of different layers. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the people in power, CEOs, are kind of in that camp of control, right? Like what is the paradigm that's going to get me the most out of my people? And I think we're seeing that with like return to work, return to office. We're seeing that with like DEI, let's take it off the table because it's not a part of the business imperative. So I think there is also a section just people in power who have benefited from the past. And
Yeah.
now people are asking for something different and that feels scary, or I don't know, like they can't exploit people like they used to, which is like really a lot of where
Yeah.
the paradigms come from.
I think also that there's something really telling in all of this. Like, even that attitude of like, leave your problems at the door and come in and work and all of those
Mm.
things, right? Like, I think it perpetuates scarcity and it
Yeah.
perpetuates this idea that you're not accepted as whole. And I think that, like, when, again, if we think about some of the marginalized groups, but even just, if you think about women who have entered the
Mhm.
workforce in a more meaningful way in the last like 60 years, 50 years, and honestly, just since the 80s, really starting to take on
Mhm.
more substantial roles besides just being secretary, receptionist.
Mhm.
Um, and we look at, immigrants who come here and
Mhm.
like literally right before, starting this podcast episode, I was on a call with, just a client wanting
Mhm.
me to do a workshop around, just the feeling of being invisible in the workplace.
Mm. Mhm.
And I think that that is very real. And so it's like they were just ingrained into that space. And I think what Gen Z has that we didn't even have as early millennials or geriatric millennials, as we're called. So
The
sad.
elders, the elder millennials.
I genuinely did not like I as a millennial, I will say it's a side tangent. I genuinely did think that we're always going to be the young ones, You
I
don't
know. Is
I'm
yeah.
like we're not middle age. What do you mean? Middle age and millennial don't go together.
I know,
Um
it doesn't make any sense. But I'm sure
yeah,
the generation before, Gen X, felt the same exact way you
totally.
do now.
But, Gen Z also has a lot of opportunities outside of corporate that we didn't have because of
Mm.
technology, right? And so now they're able to set a demand and they see it. Like, I think the other piece is that because of technology, because of social media, we've become so aware of what's possible outside of our own communities that it's raised that awareness of like, wait a second, you mean I don't have to live this way? Like this, wait,
Yeah.
what? And so that again, going back to your whole curiosity thing, it's really shifting that and it's bringing this part of that, so I would imagine that even with your work, like you're
Mhm.
having to really address that scarcity, addressing
Mhm.
even just that feeling like you said earlier, like that FOMO, but also just like maybe resentment.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, there is a little bit of resentment around the quality of work life in previous generations, and I see it with folks who are just like, "You know what? Back when I was working, we listened to our leader and we did what they said, period."
Hmm.
There is a fundamental shift in control happening, to your point, and people are saying, "I want a partnership at work. I don't want a dictatorship. I don't want an authoritative type of relationship or a power struggle. Like, I know I add value. You want value. Let's come together and make something great happen. And let's align that to things like values, which, we know from especially millennials and Gen Z is really, really important. Like the work that I do must fulfill some deeper part of my purpose and my mission. So that's a little bit more meatier than I'm going into work to collect a paycheck and then go home. And so I do think there's some resentment. I do think there's kind of this nostalgia effects of this is how things used to be for me. Now I need to lead in that way, or I need to create an environment that looks like that because that's what I know, versus the curiosity of Well, what are your needs? That's equity, right? What do you need to become successful? And for me to create the environment to provide you opportunity. And as a leader, knowing that might look different for a Gen Zer versus a baby boomer or a Gen Xer. And then I think to your point of just like starting to do some research around like how does an organization become responsive to this type of shift during the life cycle of the organization, right? So we talk about culture building and we have a lot of point in time measurements around this, but how do we build the capabilities to become responsive to social issues like COVID that fundamentally shift the way I think about work and
Right.
mortality? I mean, AI is moving faster than any of us can grasp.
Totally.
It kinda goes to the point of, like, how do we create organizations that can deal with these types of disruptions? The workplace is always at the tail end of social change. Always.
Mhm.
The very tail end, like 10 years too late. So, I think more and more people are realizing that they can't be left behind. If they are left behind, their business is going to die, and they're not gonna be
Yeah.
able to keep up.
But see, you bring up an interesting point about that because you're saying like they're at the tail end of it, but yet like there's, with COVID, with George Floyd, so much happened.
Mhm.
And then there was so much pressure that was put on, and corporate started to really have and I will say a reactionary response to it,
Yes.
which
Yes.
unfortunately 4 years later has turned into, well, nothing came out of this. So what was the point?
Yep.
And so we're seeing this like regression on forward moving of things.
Mhm.
And so we are also seeing the despair and all this stuff. And, I'm curious about like how much of this is also just like companies and people like that reactionary piece.
Mm.
Ultimately, it's like you want to do good, you want to create good, but you're not really meeting the culture, the place where you're at. And I think that what you're talking about is like, more people are demanding for this corporate responsibility, social responsibility, and everything. But it's a marathon and it's not a
Mhm.
sprint. And
Mhm.
if a company isn't necessarily ready yet to have those conversations, how do you build the foundation of being able to have those conversations?
Mhm.
Because if you literally jump from we've never done anything to now all of a sudden having these like intense conversations, they're not like that's where you're gonna get the backlash from.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you're talking about is the difference between the reactionary and responsive. So
Yeah.
when I'm talking about a responsive organization, you've built the infrastructure and the
Mhm.
connection to your core values to really lean into the things that make the heartbeat of your organization, right? Like your role is not to react to everything, but is to create infrastructure and change ready is the word that comes to mind, right? How do you create a change ready organization so that you can be responsive to these things in a effective way? And how do you have open modes of feedback with your people and understand what matters to them and how their identities show up in their work? And I the perfect example that I always share is, when the murder of George Floyd happened, I went into work on Monday during an executive meeting and I was distraught
Yeah.
and nobody else even knew what happened. Right? I mean,
Oh.
the effect that that had on me was like, I don't matter. My identity doesn't matter. The things that matter to me, obviously, there's a value disconnect. There's a cognitive dissonance now that's happening because I realize like my values are so far off, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things. So that's, I think, the other piece is understanding what the needs and the signals are from your organization and your people, but also what are the signals coming from society that we could get ahead of some of these things. When I was working as a chief people officer during COVID, and that was my last job before I decided to start my own business. And the thing that really struck me was I think every workplace was so underprepared for this type of event. Not to say you have to plan for a pandemic,
Sure.
but it wasn't just a huge event that happened. Like the shifts in perspectives if we could have seen them for what they were and really like had a receptive, intuitive leadership team, if we would have had a responsive organization that was change ready, we could have gotten ahead of a lot of the remote work and hybrid work and 3 days or 2 days. We kind of just labor over the details. But if we connect it back to the root, which was people faced their mortality right in front of their eyes,
Right.
and they finally got to the point of saying, you know what, work doesn't matter that much. It matters, but not that much. And I enjoy the walks with my dog during lunch, and I enjoy being able to put a load of laundry in between meetings. It saved me a lot of extra time and energy. I'm loving the idea that I don't have to deal with the microaggressions at work at the water cooler. Like
Yeah.
all those things happened, but we weren't talking about those things. We were just talking about how many days a week we're coming back.
Right. Again, it's like these distractions that we focus on versus the actual like root of things. But I guess the question really is that how do you have what you're talking about where totally, right? Like I think that was the biggest dramatic shift is that people it clicked in their brains that like wait a
Mhm.
second, I have just spent my entire life working or
Mm,
like people who like dedicate and become loyal to a company for 20, 30 years only to get let go, not
yeah.
get treated well. I mean, how many companies did we see during COVID where the way they let go of their members was just so horrific, was like so without compassion and empathy, but also acknowledging that we live in a capitalistic country
Mhm.
and we live in a country that defines capitalism, to be honest. And so when we have a place where it's defined by capitalism, it is, to your point, like so deeply immersed into our values that
Mhm.
everything and people I don't think realize it that even the actions that you take in how you judge others, where you live, everything ties back to this idea of capitalism. And so, how do you have, I guess, a healthy boat of capitalism where we want it to be healthy, we want capitalism to thrive, but not at the expense of people, but it seems like that's like this really hard line to balance.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about conscious capitalism, which is,
Yeah.
what you're talking about. And I think we have leaned into, humans as capital, right? I mean, human cap, like there's literally a
Yeah.
field of study called human capital, which I don't love the term because it does create this idea that we're kind of these stagnant KPIs that we can measure, and we're not.
Mhm.
And context does impact how we operate, and we are just human. So we use the reptilian part of our brain when we're under threat. Like we haven't evolved much.
Yeah.
Contrary, our environment has evolved, culture has evolved, but our brains really haven't. So I think it's interesting because there's so much research around doing good for people and that being good for business. I mean, I could probably say that sentence 50 different ways that would equate to if you treat your people well and with dignity, respect, and you meet their needs, they're going to produce tenfold for you.
Right.
But for some reason, like every other discipline, we accept data, marketing, operations, and this body of research, just people don't they hear it and they don't accept it. And my theory is because we've been so conditioned to exploit human capital that we don't want to think about a paradigm where we're actually nurturing it and understanding that that can also be conscious capitalism. Because if I have a healthy, sustainable team or workforce or organization that isn't burning out, I over time, that's going to benefit me more in my business. If my people are burning out, they're leaving the organization, I'm spending 2, 3 times more for the waste that I've created because I've burnt them out, that's a bad business. I mean, that's
Yeah.
capitalism. That's like we talk about waste in capitalism, right? I mean, that is a
Yeah.
waste. So I think if we can like I hate to like simplify this in capitalistic terms, but there are like true measures around like people only can take so much. And if we talk about sustainability, if you burn people out, you're creating waste in the system. If you're impacting people's mental health or physical health, waste in the system. So I think sometimes using those terms helps. And then also the idea of like future proofing your organization and realizing if you're going to stay stagnant from a competition perspective, you're not going to be able to perform.
Yeah. I'm just even thinking about like to take it back to even you, like you were working internally, you were, became chief people officer during one of like the wildest times in recent history, right? And now to your point of like AI is that this is a whole new revolution we're going through that we haven't had since the industrial, to the point where colleges don't even know how to prepare their students because things are changing so quickly that even within, it's no longer a 5 year like workplace mapping, it's now a 6 month, 9 month,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
things are shifting so quickly that nobody knows how to actually navigate the space.
Yes.
You decided to take a plunge and go into building your own business. You went into like supporting, but you're doing it in such a unique way with your culture lab, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're doing it in a way where instead of you being one person who is going into different companies and helping them, you're empowering change makers that are already existing in those environments and helping them really navigate the space where the trust is already built. Tell us a little bit more about that and how everything you just kind of talked about, right? The social responsibility, the sustainability, the waste, and every of those pieces plays such a big role in the anchor of like what you ultimately end up are sharing with these change makers who are trying to make that difference.
Yeah. So, I mean, a key pillar to the Culture Impact Lab is that this work is interdisciplinary. So I think oftentimes when we're gathering people in, like a hackathon or a lab or, some space where we're all creating and doing something together to create change, we end up kind of pulling in a lot of the same. And what I've recognized, and that was kind of the start of the Culture Impact Lab, was we were kind of centering this work under HR. And as much as I love my HR peeps, and I have a great community of HR professionals, so I've worked in that space. Uh, they are not the solution when it comes to this broader understanding of workplace in social fabric. And so, my goal was to bring together an interdisciplinary group of people who are looking to understand the workplace's role in the social fabric, but also to fundamentally change it. Again, kind of thinking about that Gen Y group and how are we collectively starting this movement to shift workplace paradigms that work for everybody. And so the Culture Impact Lab is essentially, we right now we have it annually. We're hoping to take it on the road next year at some point and get it into a bunch of cities around the country, maybe around the world someday,
Yeah.
and solve these really meaty challenges that these change makers are facing within their spheres of influence. So we have a change methodology called the Coal for Culture method, that we use within organizations, but we feel like also carries over into, how do you change and impact issues that are impacting the community. We think it could reach politics and policy at some point. There is a method for inviting people to an issue, creating the change, assessing that change, and then working the plan around that change. So the methodology is kind of like an undertone of the events, because we want to give people tools, but really it's about re-energizing these change makers who may be bumping up against a lot of you know um those other folks who are like not looking to change. They're looking to keep the status quo. So it's also a little bit of a refuge and retreat for people who have kind of like adopted this as a lifestyle. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it, but there's people like you and I who live to challenge and make the world better. Not everybody is like us. Like
Right.
I
There are some people who
recognize
really
that.
just don't care.
Yeah.
They just don't care and they're fine with it. And so if that's your leader, like how do you like work with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a leader who is like that, I think it goes back to your values, right? Where you either become a leader, right, and you start your own business, you make your mark in the world, or helping that leader understand kind of the impact that they have on the broader context of the people that they're managing. I always see leadership as a caregiving role. And I know a lot of people don't see it that way. They think of it as like taskmaster, program manager, but
But that's manager, not leader, right?
right, that's like glorified project manager at
Right.
best.
Right.
You are like I would also love with this work to like part the seas around who like upgrade our standards around leadership essentially as a responsibility, a
Yeah.
social responsibility even, right? Because you are managing this group of people and they're going back home to their dinner table, to their communities, and that is a ripple effect of impact. And I know we don't talk about it this way a lot, but toxic leadership, toxic workplace culture is starting to emerge as like a public health issue and actually like a
Yeah.
contributor to the mental health epidemic that we're facing
Mhm.
right now. And so I like those are the types of conversations we have in the Culture Impact Lab is this intersection of these two things that people just aren't talking about because we've always separated quote unquote church and state around
Right.
social issues at work.
And I love what you do there because you're really bringing out topics that again like they're invisible but like you're making them more visible to like wait a second, you're right, like I'm, for example, someone where it's like the movement about, mothers and new mothers and the care and space around that, but then also just the idea that like how come all of it falls into the woman and not, her
Mhm.
partner, right? And so it's like I remember it wasn't that long ago when paternity leave was like a new concept. It was not that long ago.
Yes.
And now it's like, being able to extend that out to like adoptive parents and being able to extend that out. And then, the Culture Lab, I was really excited because we were able to talk about just even formerly incarcerated individuals and just
Mhm.
about, again, what I see the work that you're doing, which I think is why I'm such a huge fan of it, is that you're not talking about the nuances that are just kind of like lay flat on, when we just talk about like, oh, let's adjust the work day and things like that.
Mhm.
You're really kind of getting into the crux of like who we are as just people, who are we as a
Mhm.
community, who are we as a,
Mhm.
like we are if COVID did anything, it also just showed how interdependent we are on each other,
Mhm.
so deeply interdependent on each other. And so, because of that, it's really looking at it as like, okay, if we are going to be continuously losing women out of the workplace, what has that done, right, to the shift? When we brought LCLC to come and talk at the Culture Lab, they pointed it out that 52% of individuals who have, who were a felon, committed a crime, will not commit another crime if they have a job. And
Yes.
what I also just love is like just being able to talk about like, oh, wait a second. We keep going into blaming things like, oh, well, we can't have that person here. We can't, do this. It's like, okay, but why? Right. And
Mhm.
if we're going to then blame the system, be like, oh, the system, like, oh, they're not taking care of the felons. They're not taking care of the new moms. They're not taking care. It's like we're putting all the onus and responsibility onto but nobody's claiming that. So it's just sitting there in a pot, like just hanging out, right? And
Yes.
so what you're talking about is a collective ownership.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think, I do wanna mention the big elephant in the room, which is support systems. Like, our support systems are failing us,
Oh my
and
god.
this is why workplaces are having to step up. So, one of the things that I talk a lot about is, as a leader, you should be pissed about that. Like, the fact that you have to offer healthcare at your organization and pay for it, aren't you pissed about that? Like, that's millions of dollars. Like, why isn't the government offering that? Or childcare. You've had to create a childcare program within your organization because the support systems that we have are failing. So, this is where I think the shift in leadership happens, where leaders are not only leading an organization, they acknowledge they're part of the social fabric and they're advocating for policy and change outside of the workplace that impacts their workers, and at the end of the day maybe saves them some money, right? Because the right social system is taking care of that thing. In my perfect dream world, like, and I know this is, we have to work in tandem for a while for this to happen, but we de-emphasize the workplace so much that it's like this small little sliver. Like I work myself out of a job.
Yeah.
Like I don't have to work on this anymore because
Right.
we're focused on community building and social systems within our community, and that's where we get our fulfillment. And we have the support systems to have proper childcare and to support incarcerated individuals who are reintegrating. And the world is a big happy place, but that's a long way from now. And in the meantime, leaders have to work in tandem, and I think that's a true responsibility of leadership, regardless of what kind of organization you work for.
Yeah, that would be the dream, is to really de-emphasize work, and, the thing is that that does exist in certain places in the
It
world.
does. It
It does
does.
exist, and they're still thriving. They're doing they're successful, and again, I think this is where when we look at the way that, our country functions in capitalism, in corporate, everything,
Mhm.
the root of that is just like you just have a bunch of wounded,
Mm,
scarcity minded humans who are just, again, it's like there's only room for so much at the top. We can only do this. And to your point, like because we have systems that are not supportive, it then the onus falls onto corporate, but then corporate's like,
mhm.
"But I'm just here to have like this, like my mission is this product that we're building or we're serving. Like,
Yeah.
why do I need to take on all this responsibility?" It's almost this you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, So I think what you just said right there is just so powerful because it's something that everyone on different sides of the political sphere can agree with, right?
Yeah.
Is that like, yeah, as a corporate, I don't wanna have the responsibility of taking care of your child and taking care of your mental
Mhm.
health and all these things. I'll create an environment that allows you to function with all of those things, but then the resources should be coming from other places that we partner with. Right?
Yes.
It's like everything is, like,
Exactly.
falling so much on one, and that's why then the
Mhm.
corporations are breaking down, and that's why then people are leaving, right? And what, by 2027, it's supposed to be, like, 52% will be part of the gig economy,
Yep.
And it's like, okay, so what does that mean for ongoing for organizations? Like, there's so much change happening right now.
People are trying to fill in the gaps however they can, right? And that's in response to gaping holes in the system. And so, yeah, I think that is a very big shift in mentality around businesses and leadership. There's a report that comes out every year. I know you've probably heard of it, but I talk about it a lot, which is the Edelman Trust Barometer. It is fascinating because it's like a signal for me and like what's happening in society. And over since COVID, essentially, trust in government and media has dropped significantly, and businesses has risen. So
Wow.
that means that people, when you talk about trust in like innovation and my information that I get on a day-to-day basis, people are looking to their employers to provide them that, not the news, not the media, not their government.
What do you think that's about?
Well, I mean, I think that's the signal that there is a responsibility to take on there,
Mhm.
or to shift it, or to advocate it and shift it back to where it needs to be. But,
Yeah.
COVID really did a number on the public's trust. And people, like, when I was a chief people officer, I was the source of truth, and that was
Mm.
really scary, and that was a huge responsibility, but I had to respond to it because people were like, "I don't trust the news." Everyone was watching a different media outlet, right?
Right.
And everyone had different information. "I don't trust the government. I don't trust the vaccines. I don't trust this. I don't trust that." People would come to me to be like, "What do I do? Do I get the vaccine?" And I'm like, "Well, here's the information." And I
Yeah.
had to literally compile everything. We had a daily town hall where I compiled all of the most factual information I could find, and I became the source of truth. And that's
A
that's a
lot.
really reality and a pressure that I think companies are facing right now.
Yeah. I think again, right, it goes back to the collective ownership because if media was doing its job,
Yep.
and producing factual information. And we're not just sitting there with opinions,
Yep.
right? It's like the
Mhm.
24-hour news cycle completely shifted what media does, how media acts. And if yeah, the government was I mean, can we make the government a little bit more efficient, please? Like, I think that's the other problem,
And
right?
then
It's like,
you and I need a seat at
seriously,
the table, and we need to make
100%.
that happen.
Yes. So it really is a collective ownership that is
Yes.
really being failed, and everyone's just trying to point fingers versus taking any kind of responsibility towards it. So I'm so, I think anyone who can participate in your culture lab, who,
Oh, thank you.
just your belief system, like the way that
Mm,
your mission about it, like it's you're only going to benefit from it because it's the conversations that are just not happening at the pace that they need to be happening to keep up.
mm,
So,
mhm,
I always like to ask the question of, we already know what you're trying to reframe from like the workplace, and we already know what you're trying to shift in that perspective. I'm curious that for you yourself as having worked internally, now being an entrepreneur, having your
mm,
own team, things like that, right? You've now been in seats where you've been the employee, you are the employer, like there's just so
mhm.
many roles that you play in your own personal life. What is something that you internally are also now recognizing, maybe this is something I need to reframe in order for me to also continue to do better work for the community I'm trying to impact?
Oh, yeah, that's a really great question. I think I've reframed. I mean, you and I have talked about this quite a bit, but I'm basically re-engineering my entire outlook on what my business needs to be and how I need to leverage my strengths to make the impact that I want. Going back to that point around not everybody has made this work a lifestyle. Not
Yeah.
everyone wakes up thinking about challenging and changing. And, it's interesting because we have a lot of people talking about, childless women these days.
Yeah.
And how could we possibly be interested in the state of this country and the future and the legacy? And it's like the complete opposite for me. I'm like,
Yeah.
I feel like there's so much legacy that I can build around this work, and it's not in the form of a little human, but it's in the form of impact to a community of people. It's in the form of fundamentally changing the relationship that we have with work. It comes in the form of changing leadership, making people healthier, happier, communities healthier, happier, creating equity and justice and fairness. So for me, I've really kind of reframed like the second half of my life, in a
Yeah.
way. Like I know we said we're not middle aged, but we kind of are.
Yeah.
Life expectancy is what, 76 these days. So I've kind of like, yeah, I know. It's sad. It's actually going down.
Wow. I thought it was like 90.
Mm-mm. For
Dang.
women, I think it's 77, 76.
Yeah.
I'll have to look it up. But I am middle aged. We are
Yeah.
middle aged. Like technically,
Hi,
from
my
that
name is Pyle, and I am
perspective,
a middle-aged millennial.
but you and I are going to live till we're at least 98. So
Easy.
easy,
Yeah.
100 even. But, I am thinking about the second half of my life and what it needs to look like, what it needs to be, type of legacy that I want to leave. And then also just like optimizing me in a way to be, I know it sounds maybe a little woo woo, but be that vessel and to be able to do that effectively and to hold space for people. And like there's a whole, I think, health part of that and keeping my mind and body and all of that intact so that I can be this vessel of change and then to scale that change through the culture impact lab and the community we're building. So I
Yeah.
know that was all over the place, but that's
No,
been
it
my
makes
my key reframe.
yeah, no, I think it makes it's beautiful because that, again, to your point of like, if you don't have a child, then what do you care about the contribution? And I agree with
Mhm.
you wholeheartedly. It's that actually, because I'm not focusing insular into just this one micro way, I'm actually able to look at a macrocosm, and I'm able to look at things of like, how can I make a more macro impact versus
Okay.
only worrying about this one child or worrying
Yeah.
about that one person, right? Like it's more of like, and I get asked this all the time. It's just like, oh, you know, having a kid, I'm like, I'd rather actually make a shift and change in how we look at, for example, social services for kids, you know? I
Mhm.
mean, it
Yeah.
is really toxic if we look at what they get put into when they're in the foster care system and everything. Like, there's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff there that we need to address. If I could actually make a shift where it impacts hundreds of kids,
Yes.
life goal met.
Yes. I wanna help your kids have a
Yeah.
thriving, successful life. I wanna be the community auntie
Yeah.
to
I
my
love it.
friend. I wanna
Yeah.
create the, a TikTok and the Instagram. See, this is how old I am.
Yeah.
The Instagram. They talk about like, "Oh, I'm gonna buy up a plot of land and have all the," like,
Right.
that those are my goals, and,
Yeah.
just the idea of community, I think, is really important,
Yeah.
um, because, I do see previous generations, like, even my parents who all they had was each other.
Right.
And my mom is now, in her 70s, and we lost my dad in 2015, and she has no sense of purpose. Even though she has
Mm.
me, she's lost sense of purpose because she's been not lost sense of purpose, she's redefining her sense of purpose because she had my dad and she had me. And both of those
Yep.
things are, not gone, but in different
Right.
contexts.
Shifted.
Yeah, so, the idea of, like, building community so that I'm also preparing myself for aging and different stages of life is another reframe that I've never really thought about until I was, like my birthday's next week, so I'm, like, thinking about,
Oh,
I'm in my
yeah.
late 30s now, it's a different
Yep.
world.
Yeah. I could keep talking to you so
Yes.
much. Thank you so much, Angela. Like,
Thank you.
what would be like one question that you just want to leave people with, to just internally reflect for themselves or like something just easy that they can just think about like as they're just like going through their day as change makers, as,
Mm.
just in their life, in their families, in their homes, whatever, as they're how can they be a part of the generation Y?
Mm. What paradigms are you holding on to and why?
Fantastic. That's all you gotta ask yourself. You don't need to make any changes yet, nothing. Just
Yeah.
just
Ask the
understand that
question.
for
Just ask
now.
the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, if something feels like if you're feeling tension around a paradigm and you're realizing the world is maybe moving too fast, in our heads, right? The world's moving too fast. Maybe think about what you're holding on to and why that matters, and does it matter?
Yeah. Love it. Thank you so much, Angela.
You have.
Um, sure I can find you on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and of course, where else can people reach out to you?
Yeah, yeah, you can search me under Angela R. Howard on LinkedIn, and our website is callforculture.com, and all the information about the Culture Impact Lab is there, our podcast, our services, anything you wanna know about Call for Culture, you could find there.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really hope that you enjoy this episode, and I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.